Welcome, everybody. Thanks for signing on. I can see that there's still some people signing on, but in the interest of time, we'll get started. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I know that many of you have been attending the whole series, and you've heard this introduction from me a number of times. And I just wanted to start at the get-go to say thanks for being patient as I run through this introduction for the benefit of those who haven't had a chance to attend the prior talks. So my name is Haley Ross, and I work for the Columbia Mountains Institute of Applied Ecology. And today we are here to present the 6th season of CREDtalks. These are the Columbia Region Ecological Discussions. And this whole series, the season 6, follows the theme of climate disruption in the Upper Columbia Basin. We're welcoming 8 scientists to address projected impacts, potential for adaptation, and what we can do with ecosystems that may in fact contribute to mitigation. If you're in attendance today, you've likely seen the impressive list of speakers who have already contributed and continue to contribute to this series. But if you're just tuning in for this one recording, I encourage you to go to the event webpage and check out the full suite of speakers in the series, because collectively they are telling a much bigger and very important story. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Suzanne Simard, of course, and I'll be introducing her in more detail in just a moment. So the CREDtalks are financially supported by the Columbia Basin Trust, and we share our gratitude with them for providing the funds needed to get this series off the ground. The series is also generously supported by all of you. Thank you very much for your donations. They truly do make a huge difference, and this project would not be possible without them. So thank you for your support. I also want to thank people who are viewing recordings and still sending us donations. We've had a few donations coming in from folks who have later reviewed recordings, and I want to thank you very much for those as well. Before we go any further, I'd like to just pause for a moment and acknowledge the 4 nations on whose unceded territory I broadcast from today in Revelstoke, BC. So that is the Sinixt, the Ktunaxa, the Secwepemc, and the Silks. And those of you who've been attending this series, I see that Suzanne beat us to the chase again this week. You know the series. What I would like to do now is invite you to share your own acknowledgement in the chat. So use the chat to share with us whose territory you're zooming in from today, and feel free to introduce yourself. So if you are new to Zoom, as I know a couple of you are because I've received your emails, you can find the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. So if you hover your mouse at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little button that says chat. If you click that open, there's an opportunity to type in messages to everyone. You can also send a message to hosts and panelists if you'd like to get the attention of myself or Nicole Trigg in the background here. If, for example, you're having technical issues. So go ahead and share your acknowledgement in the chat. Thank you very much for doing that. And as those roll in, I'm going to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about your host organization, the Columbia Mountains Institute, or CMI for short. We are a nonprofit society and an association for people working in the various fields of ecology. Our home range is southern British Columbia, Canada, but increasingly we are seeing membership from across BC into Alberta, and including the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. One of the main things we do is provide professional development opportunities for ecologists. And those often come in the form of conferences, courses, and of course, webinars. I often give a big long list of examples of the types of things we do, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to refer you to our event website, which is www.cmiae.org. You should see that on the top right-hand side of your screen there. And go to the past event section and you'll see a big long list of types of events and the activities that we do. One of the things that often gets overlooked on our website that I would draw your attention to are, of course, event recordings, such as these, and proceedings documents. These are really resource-rich documents that come out of our larger events, such as our conferences. Our typical audience is well captured by the registration for the CREDtalks, in fact. And they include representatives from environmental consultants, academics, students, industry representatives, nonprofits, First Nation governments, and provincial and municipal resource managers. Now what I'm going to do is just dive into a bit of a nitty-gritty Zoom orientation for those of you who are new to Zoom, and just a bit of a setup on how our series is going to go today, or our talk today. So first off, the talk is being recorded, as I already mentioned, and that recording will be posted to the event webpage within 1 week of the live talk taking place. We're in the webinar format, which means that the attendees' videos have been disabled, and you've also all been muted. If you'd like to be unmuted to ask a question in the Q&A period, however, you're welcome to request that privilege. So you can use the raise hand icon. So again, if you take your mouse to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a number of buttons there, and you can click on the raise hand, as I just did. And that will pop your name to the top of our participant list, and that'll give us the flag to unmute you for a question in the Q&A. We'll aim to communicate with you via the chat once you raise your hand. So if you are raising your hand, also open your chat to make sure that you can communicate with the facilitation team. I'm going to lower that there. The chat feature has been enabled, as we said, and that's a great opportunity for everyone to share resources with one another. But I just want to note that we're not going to be putting our questions into the chat. So for the questions, what we're going to be using is the Q&A feature. So again, if you hover your mouse at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A box. If you click that open, you'll see that a Q&A box opens up on your screen, and that is where we're going to put our questions. You are welcome to add your questions as the talk progresses, and then we'll relay those questions to Suzanne at the end of her talk. Marc-Andre, thanks very much, is right on top of it. He's put in a sample question for us right now, which is the middle color of the rainbow. And we've got some people who are giving a thumbs up on that question. So people are upvoting that question. So the idea is that we've enabled the upvote so that if someone else has already asked a question that you would also like to hear the answer to, you can click on the thumbs up that appears underneath that question. And then when I'm reading the questions out, I'm going to order them in the order of most upvotes so that the most popular questions are answered, are presented first. Okay, thanks, Marc-Andre, for doing that. I think that's about it for our Zoom orientation. And with that done, let's move on to the real reason why you're here today. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Suzanne Simard, who is going to present the Mother Tree Project, Finding New Ways to Practice Forestry in Our Changing Climate. Dr. Suzanne Simard is a professor of forestry, of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia and the lead of the Mother Tree Project. She conducts research on ecological relationships between trees, soils, climate, and disturbances that are the foundation of forest structure and function. She is known for her work on below-ground fungal networks that connect trees and facilitate inter-tree communication. And she is investigating how this underpins the complexity, adaptability, and the resilience of forests to climate change. She has published over 200 scientific and popular science articles. Her book, Finding the Mother Tree, was published in 2011 by Knopf at Penguin Random House. And as of last week, as I was just mentioning to Suzanne, it hit #1 on the best-selling book in Canada, as a #1 book, best-selling book in Canada. So congratulations, Suzanne, and thank you for taking the time to meet with us. I'm going to hand this over to you.
Thank you, Haley. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm looking forward to talking to everybody. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, does that look good, Haley?
It looks great.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk to you today about the Mother Tree Project. This is a project that I've been doing since 2015, and it's a 100-year project. So we'll pass my lifetime, and will be those for the generations of the future. But it's a good start, and I just want to first just, you know, everybody's been sending in their land acknowledgements, which is so lovely to see. And I just want to acknowledge I'm in Nelson, British Columbia right now. on the unceded territories of the Ktunaxa, the Sinaiaks, and the Silex nations. But my work, and you'll see this map of the Pacific Rim Forest, which includes this area. My work is actually, and if you can see my arrow, extends from the border with the United States all the way up into the subboreal forests and down the coast. The Mother Tree Project itself is expanding. It's becoming a network which ultimately might include much more of just our British Columbia forests and hopefully down through the entire Pacific Rim. That's work that we're working on planning right now. But this is the seed of it. And there's so many fascinating results and ways forward emerging from it. So there's great interest around the world. And yeah, so the project itself occurs on many territories and in many nations, including nations that are not federally recognized, such as the Montequila on the coast. So yeah, so I just wanted to express that this is a multi government to government project that includes academics and industry and nations and communities and students, all kinds of people coming together over a common love for our forests. And, I think everybody here today, I'm sure, is here to say, we need to find a way to care for our forests as climate changes. And what might have worked in the past is not necessarily going to work in the future, but certainly we can borrow from our knowledge of the past to guide us forward. But we also have to try new things and combine traditional knowledge, Western science, and innovations to help our forests adapt and also at the same time mitigate climate change. This is an old growth cedar forest. It's actually from Fairy Creek. This is the grandfather tree. You might have heard of that tree. It's an enormous ancient tree, probably about 2,000 or more years old. And I just wanted to talk about, what the presence of these trees means for us, for the world. I mean, there's so many things all of you could list a dozen things about why they're important, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. One is, scientists now know, in contrary to what we thought even 10 years ago, that old trees continue to sequester carbon deep into their old age. And that carbon is stored not just in their trunks and their roots, but into the whole soil food web that is in symbiosis with those trees. So that these ecosystems are continuing to accrue carbon through time. These Fairy Creek ecosystems actually contain as much carbon as a tropical rainforest in the Amazon, 1,300 kilograms or 1,300 tons per hectare. So that's number one. They're incredible carbon storehouses. And hand in hand with that, or the reason for that, is because these old trees are also housed or are the homes of great biodiversity. So trees, now we know are not just individuals, they're in symbiosis, in symphony with thousands of other creatures. They're microbiomes, really. We know that, for example, the mycorrhizal fungi associated with these old trees number in the hundreds, if not thousands of species. They all do different jobs, bringing in nutrients and water from the soil to feed this huge tree. And in return, the tree supplies it with enormous amounts of photosynthetic energy. That photosynthetic energy also is food for the mosses and the lichens and the other cryptogams that are growing in and on these trees, the endophytes, the understory plants, the animals, the birds, the marble murrelets, the screech owls, the speckled-bellied lichens, all are reliant on the photosynthetic capacity of these old trees. And in turn, the old trees are reliant on the incredible biodiversity associated with them to help them live and help them live in productive ecosystems. That's why we're all here. And I think that we all we all have reverence for these incredible ancient creatures. And and it stretches back for millennia. These are this is in the Kamloops area in the Tlekamex, nation where we've got, this is where I actually grew up as a child. I grew up actually in lots of areas, but this is where I spent a lot of my childhood, across from the river from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And these old trees along the shoreline, a lot of them gone now, but they played so many roles, not just here, but all over our province. And in this case, this old tree is actually servicing the drying of salmon, which were harvested in this river using all kinds of technologies. So these trees, you know, they contain the living DNA, the very living creatures that live in and around them. They're not one and alone, they're in community and in community with us as well. And of course, we've seen dramatic changes to our landscape. I grew up, I always say I grew up in a province of old growth forests, and I did. I was born in 1960, and I've seen it transformed into a province of clear cuts. And along with this, as we all know, has come, you know, more and more changes to our climate, to our biodiversity. We know that forestry is a primary cause of global carbon emissions. In fact, it exceeds carbon emissions from fossil fuel emissions in British Columbia, and when combined with wildfire, estimates are that forestry and forest-related disturbances contribute 4 times as much carbon dioxide emissions as oil and gas. So the impacts are huge. And we also know, and even our own governments and Forest Practices Code or Practices Board has counted that we are losing species as a result of these practices. So we're ripe for change. We're at a time where transformation is needed. We're at a time when the consequences of climate change we're living in it every day. You know, in Nelson, for example, I could hardly breathe for a month because of the wildfires and the smoke settling in our valley. We all know what happened in Merritt. We all know what happened in Princeton. We all know that over harvesting and global change leading to wildfires, and then the spread of wildfires in our cut landscapes are all linked together, and that we need to do something about this to mitigate these dramatic changes. So that's why I'm here today. Is to talk about ways forward, to ways that we can transform our practices so that we can still harvest, you know, wood and have a livelihood, but have a more regenerative kind of forestry, not so much of an exploitive kind of forestry. And I would say that, you know, we have to make these changes or we're going to see more of what we're seeing at Fairy Creek. You know, people are worried about their lives. They're worried about their children. They're worried about our forests. And, you know, they're going to be standing up. And so it's better that we're in front of this and have ideas from the outset. So business as usual of clear cutting, taking out whole valleys like is threatened for Fairy Creek is no longer okay. So I'm going to just go back before I start talking about the Mother Tree Project. I just want to talk about, you know, the origins of it. And I started, you know, working on ideas about this at the beginning of my career, as we all do, right? We start getting ideas and thinking and learning from forests. And I learned over my career that, you know, that old forests have a great deal of connection in them. I studied below ground connections, and learned that these old forests are actually linked together in so many ways. And I'm going to show you a picture in a minute. You know, not just below ground as I've studied, but above ground. And I started out in these dry belt forests, these dry belt fir forests. That's where some of my fundamental work was done. And now, as I said, I'm spreading it across the province and beyond. And I also just wanted to acknowledge that all this work that I'm showing you, yeah, I'm sort of like the face of the Mother Tree Project, but the people that make it work are the students. And so there's a whole bunch of graduate students and undergraduate students, even high school students from Nelson, who are working on the Mother Tree Project. And honestly, it is so, it brings so much joy to them to be part of a solution, to know that they're agents of change, to know that they're doing good in this world and that they're going to be helping us all move forward. And I just think that getting our kids out there and doing this work, and there's going to be so much work. Honestly, what I'm talking about, this transformation is going to require all hands on deck. It brings them in, and they're innovative and smart and energetic, and that is we need them out in the bush. So I think by now you've probably all seen this picture. This is that old growth Douglas fir forest I was just showing you. What we did, with my graduate students is we figured out that this forest is a highly connected place. And so in this picture, the trees are represented by these green circles, and the fungal linkages, the mycorrhizas, those symbionts that all trees associate with, where the mycelium brings water and nutrients from the soil and delivers it back to the tree in exchange for photosynthate, that these fungal linkages are ubiquitous in our forests, that they link all of the trees together. And in this particular map of this Douglas fir forest with some big old trees here and some little saplings underneath, all of these trees are linked together. And this map includes 2 of 100 mycorrhizal fungal species in this forest. And so if we had been able to do a complete map, you would quickly know that our forest floor and our soils are packed with these linkages, that these trees are intimately linked. Every root is linked to other trees, and every tree is linked to every other tree. This tree, for example, is the oldest tree in this forest. It's about a 250-year-old Douglas fir tree, and it's linked to 80% of the other trees in this forest. And it's linked to this tree way over here too, not directly, but through a series of linkages to in-between trees. They are linked together. So when you're in a forest, no matter how large it is, unless you've got some highway running through the middle of it, everything is linked over vast areas. What is the importance of these linkages? They're huge. It's hugely important. And I would say, I'm looking at below ground, but these connections are also occur above ground. So for example, the transmission of carbon and nitrogen and water that we've all measured in this below ground web is also occurring above ground, that there's all kinds of organic compounds moving back and forth between trees. They're messaging each other as though they're on their iPhones, telling them each other about their health, their stress, their nutrient status, whether they need water. So it is a very active place. It is not a static place at all. And these trees are not in isolation. They're in community, just like we're in community. And yeah, they do compete with each other. Sure, they shade each other for sure. But in that process of shading and getting resources, they're also in aid of each other. So we know, for example, that this big old tree is shuttling carbon and nutrients to its neighbors, especially to the younger seedlings underneath. And this is where, in studying this forest, I was so interested, because in looking at a multi-aged forest like this, it gives you some inferences about what the network is doing. So we know that the seeds from these old trees germinate in the forest floor. The little seedlings take about a month before they tap into this vast mycorrhizal network. They start getting that huge resource uptake that's supported by the parent trees around them. And these old trees at the same time are shuttling them nutrients and carbon and water until they get enough photosynthetic area that they can become replete themselves and even start sharing with their neighbors. And it's not just these resources, it's also information. And we're just kind of touching the surface of information transmission between trees, but we know they send things like their identity, are they related or not? They can tell. And it's through this chemistry, the chemistry between these trees that conveys that information. They also provide information about whether they're under attack or being munched on by an herbivore or infected by a pathogen. So that information is also being transmitted. And we're just getting started. I think the more we look, the more we're going to find out what that language is. But I think the important point here is that the forest is a community. In fact, it's almost like a society where you have individuals who are in relationship with all others around, and that they are in civil caring of each other, even as they compete with each other. So this is a transformative idea, not just an idea, it's a finding. It's not even my finding, it's a finding that's the result of many people's work. including First Nations who have known about these connections in fact for thousands of years, and they've been written about it and handed that down through their oral histories. And so really what I've done and my students is we've rediscovered something that's always been under our feet. So this idea really was the foundation for designing the Mother Tree Project, and keeping in mind, three things. One, that, these big old trees, what we now call mother trees, are the most important or the most highly connected trees in the ecosystem. I mentioned their biodiversity and carbon sequestration outsized ability. They also are most highly connected, so they're very important. So individual big old trees have outsized roles in community. The second thing to note is that trees can recognize which are their own kin, so they know there is a degree or a pattern of relatedness in forests, and that old trees will actually provide more protection and more resources to kin. So there is this kinship going on. That's the second thing. And then the third important point in the design is that these trees, whether they're of different species in this community, even though this is a Douglas fir forest, I've also looked at mixed forests, and they also transmit information and resources between species. Even species will be sharing and competing and collaborating together. So there's a community effect, even in a very diverse community. So these are the underpinning fundamental principles of the Mother Tree Project. So just keeping in mind that these old trees are the center, it's called the Mother Tree Project because they are the center. So the Mother Tree Project, and I'm just going to take you through the design of it, and keep in mind that we're expanding this project, and I invite anybody who wants to be part of this or has ideas of how to make it more, provide more information for all that we need to come to and talk to me. But we started out and we said, okay, we want to look across a climate gradient. And so the Mother Tree Project right now involves 9 forests, 9 75-hectare forests that are distributed across the climate gradient of the distribution of Douglas fir, from hot, dry forests, so hot and dry with a very low aridity, a low summer heat moisture index, all the way up to, the other way around, cool and dry, all the way up to hot and wetter, and all combinations in between. So we have a range of aridities from low aridity climates, for example, wetter, cooler forests, to hotter, drier forests. Sorry if I confuse you there. I'm sorry, I confused myself too. It'll become clear in a second. Okay, so we have this climate gradient, and the idea of the climate gradient is, we want to see what's happening on the ground. We have lots of models, and models are great. We have, we can look through the past, and looking through dendrochronology is great, but there's nothing like trying things on the ground and seeing how things happen. And so the idea of the gradient is that we can use kind of the space for time idea that climate change is going to happen over the next centuries, but we can look at a cooler forests and drier forests to see how those cooler forests might behave like the drier forests in the future. So we can sort of learn from one forest to inform another. Okay, so the other thing we did is we have tried different ways of retaining old trees in harvesting practices, with the idea that we would continue with some harvesting, of course, saving forests at the same time. I'll come back to that at the end. We still need to save whole growth forests, but in forests where we do harvest, such as second growth forests, or forests that are well planned for harvest, that we can look at a gradient of possibilities. So we're comparing intact forests with forests where we leave 60% of the old trees, with the idea that we're leaving old mother trees with their whole community, and then creating little patches around them that are open for regeneration to happen. And comparing that to where we're retaining 30% of the mother trees in terms of basal area. In this case, where the idea was to retain the mother trees and their related families around them, if you want to call them that, their relatives. So this is like a patch retention treatment. And then retaining mother trees as singles. So sort of like the seed tree method, but with the realization that we often lose some of these old trees because they blow over or they die from shock or drought. And we actually lose a good proportion, even within the first few years after harvest. I think some estimates are like 30% are gone. And certainly we're seeing that kind of thing in our treatments as well as we've applied them. And then of course, we're comparing this to clear cut harvesting, which is our standard operating practice for most of British Columbia. And not only that, we're also looking at, if we can retain some old trees, how can we also help regeneration? We know that climate velocity is really, really high, that the ability of our genotypes to keep up with the rate of climate change it's impossible for them. They can't adapt fast enough. They can't migrate fast enough. And so people have a responsibility and an opportunity to move genotypes and move trees around so that we keep forests adaptive and resilient. And so that's what we're doing is we're introducing a broad range of genotypes, from local genotypes to genotypes that are from drier and cooler areas to genotypes that are wetter and colder. And so every site, every one of our 9 sites has up to 11 genotypes and different species that we're growing together. And then we're looking at, how can we, look at that and inform how we can transfer, the transfer of seed to changing areas. So this is just where our forests are. We've got forests in near Cranbrook. That's our most southernmost, hottest forest. We have in the Columbia Basin, we have forests at Narrows Creek near near Balfour and Proctor. We have a site at Redfish Creek, and we have a site at Two-Bit Creek just north of Cranbrook along the Arrow Lakes. Then we also have a whole bunch of sites that go all the way from John Prince, Alex Fraser, and Williams Lake. So John Prince is near Prince George, Williams Lake, Kamloops, Merritt, and then we have a site at near Vancouver at the Malcolm Knapp Research Forest. And we're planning for sites up through the Kwakwaka'wakw territory, the Haltzik, and into the Haida Gwaii in the coming year and more. Okay, sorry, I keep hitting my thing there. So what do these forests look like? They vary, of course, because the climate's different, and probably a lot of you are familiar, from the northern forests where there are multi-species, but we have a minimum of 50% basal area Douglas fir as a criteria, all the way down to our hot, dry forests in the Cranbrook and Cranbrook area. And, but, along this gradient, we do have a really great distribution of productivity for Douglas fir. So that's our model species. We knew a lot about Douglas fir to start with, so it was the logical one for us to start looking at. The results would be a little different for different species compositions, but the general principles will apply. So we have, in our aridity gradient from the coolest, wettest forests at Malcolm Knapp, all the way down to the hottest forest at Jaffrey, we have a nice gradient of Douglas fir site index. So we're very happy that we are able, with this gradient, we're able to predict really nicely if we're going to try to use this space for time idea for predicting and adapting as climate changes. Once we had selected our 9 forests, which are really large, they each have 3 replicates of all these treatments I just talked about, the 3 harvesting treatments. We had to do a whole bunch of work, and we're continue to go back year after year after year. Every year we're in here at the beginning and monitoring every year, and we'll continue to do that as long as we can get funding to keep going. So it started out with doing, looking at what's there in advance. What are the trees? What are the mosses, lichens, the whole biodiversity? Looking at all the wood on the ground. Where's the dead wood? What is the litter like? What's the forest floor like? Taking samples back to the lab, analyzing them for carbon and nitrogen and anything that we couldn't see in the forest. And then processing them. And I would say, I keep saying this, every year I employ a couple of dozen students who are doing this work. There is so much opportunity to come and do more detailed work in these forests. We're just looking at the basic stuff. We don't have enough resources to say, look at all the lichens and how they're responding. So for example, or the birds or the sun. So there's great opportunity to come in if you're thinking of it, if you have students, that we're always welcome people to come in with their ideas. Okay, after we did our baseline measurements, we came in and we planted these trees ourselves. planted all these sites after the harvest. The harvesting was all done by the major licensees or whatever, or the First Nations or the community forest, whoever we were collaborating with in that area. So as I mentioned, it's hugely collaborative. We have to mark our seedlings because we are tracking these Douglas fir genotypes. And so just the act of tracking individual trees is a huge effort and very costly, but we're doing that. This is one of our students. This is Leah Hart, who is Haida. Her dad is actually Jim Hart, who carved the Truth and Reconciliation pole outside of UBC. So we especially love to have First Nations kids come and work with us, and also to collaborate and communicate with the First Nations whose territory we are working within. So Leah is here, and she's looking at the diversity of plants as a result of this this 30% harvest at John Prince. So let me show you some of the results. So some of these things you already know. Most of you are already good ecologists, and so one of the first things is naturally tree species richness declines with climate aridity. As it gets hotter and drier, we go from many species together to mostly just Douglas fir. So that's interesting. What's reflected in the below ground community, though, is a little bit different. So, overall, this is the all species richness. When you count the trees, the shrubs, the herbs, and especially if you encountered what's going on below ground, overall biodiversity actually goes up from the wettest to the hottest, driest sites. So that diversity is really important on stress sites in order to supply all the goodies that a tree needs in order to photosynthesize and support that broad community. So there's a greater diversity, for example, of shrubs and herbs when you're in these drier communities. Okay, I'm going to pass through this one, and I'm going to talk about carbon for a second. So carbon stocks also are correlated with climate. And so this is our hottest, driest site. This is called Venables, which is actually, Jaffrey is here. So Jaffrey wasn't actually our hottest, right? We've added a couple more sites since then. So we've got 2 more new sites. Now we have 11 sites as of this year. Venables is near Spence's Bridge. It's our hottest, driest site. And you can see that its carbon content, so these are carbon stocks, is about, it's about a third to a half of what's in the wettest site, which is at Malcolm Knapp. This is really important from a conservation point of view. When people are looking at carbon stocks, and you'll hear about this, even I talk about this, is we've got to look and save our biggest, richest carbon stocks. We've got to be saving these stocks because this is where we can sequester more carbon, we can store it. And if we lose those stocks, we actually accelerate climate change. And I mentioned that, forestry activities are responsible for more emissions than even fossil fuel consumption. So these wet forests are extremely important. And along the coast, you'll remember I said Fairy Creek had 1,300 tons of carbon per hectare. That's twice as much as our wettest site in the Mother Tree project, which is Malcolm Knapp. So, it makes you think, but keep in mind to remember I said that most of the biodiversity, if we're looking at total biodiversity, it's the other way around, not tree diversity, but all diversity together. So these are interesting things. And when we look though at trees, let's not think about the whole ecosystem, just the trees. And I'm just going to talk about that for a minute. So this is ecosystem carbon here along the y-axis. This is tree species richness, so number of trees. So 1, 2, all the way up to 15 if you're in a really, really mixed Kootenay mixed forest. And you can see with tree species, if you just look at trees, which are the foundation of the forest, which fix the most carbon, which contain the most carbon of all those creatures, even though they might not, perform all those different functions, they don't, but they have outsized role in carbon stocks. So you can see that as richness goes up, so does carbon stocks. Now, this is a natural gradient, so it's hard to draw cause and effect here, but there's definitely a pattern. And it makes sense because when you have high species richness, and this is just a log-log transformation of richness and carbon stocks, and you can see it's a linear log-log transformed relationship. It's really strong. And I have to say that this is not just unique to this area. This has been described by scientists around the world, including in the International Union of Forest Research Organizations. So it's well established. Why is it? Well, the reason, I think, is because these trees, this diversity of trees, have niches, and they fulfill a wide range of niches. When you have many tree species, not only are they capturing light more fully and able to fix more carbon through photosynthesis, they're also able to capture more resources from the soil pool because they're occupying different layers in the soil. They have different mycorrhizal fungi with them. And so they're able to more fully capture that site. You have more productivity with a higher species richness than you do with a monoculture. So for that reason alone, we should be moving away from planting one or two species, if you have a site that's adapted to capturing more species. So even in a Douglas fir forest, we know dry belt fir actually does include Douglas fir and aspen and ponderosa pine, but we usually just plant Douglas fir. So we have opportunities here to increase carbon sequestration through tree species. Understory plants do the same thing. The higher diversity of understory plants, they're also doing those jobs of fixing carbon and allocating it into the soil where it's kept quite stable. Okay, so let's look at some of these harvesting effects on our results. So these are all the different treatments: control, 60% retention. This is at John Prince Research Forest, 30% seed tree and clear cut. And I'm gonna just show you again. Oops, sorry. It's my mouse. Look at carbon stocks. What is the effect of harvesting on carbon stocks? And there's all kinds of misinformation out there, and I'm sure most of you probably know this already, but the general public doesn't know and has misinformation in their minds about the effect of clear cutting on, or the effect of harvesting on carbon stocks and carbon sequestration. Well, here's the data. This is like very solid data. This involves thousands of plots across our 11 sites. And you can see in the uncut control, so the green is what's in the trees. This is carbon stocks in trees, in snags, in coarse woody debris, in small woody debris, in stumps, in forest floor and mineral soil. And so you can see, as you take away more and more trees, as you increase the intensity of your harvest, the more carbon you lose. It's kind of a no-brainer there from above ground processes. But the interesting thing here is that we're also losing below ground stocks. And in our forests, about half of our carbon is below ground. You can see that if you count the coarse woody debris, about half of it is on the forest floor and below. That of that half that's in the soil, half of that roughly is in the forest floor. And what our harvesting practices are doing is it's really having a huge impact on the forest floor, which is the rich carbon stocks. And that forest floor, as you get into the more coastal ecosystems, there is even more and more and more stored in that forest floor. It's even more crucial. When you look all across Canada, recent analysis shows that actually over all of Canada, the boreal forest, the Canadian Shield, that 95% overall of our carbon is stored in soils and in forest floor and organic soils. So this is incredibly important, that we're actually losing 60% on average carbon from our forest floor through our conventional harvesting practices. How could that be? I mean, we have our soil degradation rules. We have tried to practice to not remove forest floor. We might move it around, we think, but we're certainly not losing it. But when we go in and actually measure it, yes, we are losing it. What's happening to it? What I think is that our machines, that we've moved so much towards machine logging that the operators don't realize that these machines are actually pushing this, gouging out, pushing this forest floor. It ends up in piles. Some of it ends up being burned, or it just increases in decomposition because it's all exposed to the atmosphere. So this is a massive problem that can be easily fixed, right? This is a place where we can easily fix this problem. We can, and I think we can talk about, change the technology, just change the technology. There are ways to do this. Okay, let me go next to not just carbon effects, but there's also biodiversity effects. And this is kind of, biodiversity is difficult to look at because there's so many ways to look at it. All we're looking at are plants and cryptograms, But where the big losses are in general are in tree species diversity, because we tend to select for trees that, that we want. And so we reduce the diversity that way. And we're leaving just a few, the aspens and birches, for example. And the other place we're losing is in the bryodes, or the cryptograms. We're losing mosses and lichens. And you could say, well, who cares about that? Well, actually, it's really important because they also are huge regulators of water in these ecosystems. So the lichens in the trees and on the stems are letting out water during the summer season to keep those forests moist and reducing fire hazard. On the moss on the forest floor is where nitrogen fixation occurs, where certain minerals are acquired and shared among other plants. So these are really, and of course, habitat for wildlife is also incredibly important. So these laws are really important. Okay, so now I just want to look at regeneration quickly. I know it's 10 to 1, but there's a few things I just want to show you here. So this is natural regeneration. So it's not the planted stuff. I'll show you that in a second. And I'm just going to show you parts of this figure. This is species richness across different tree retention levels. And this is from the highest aridity environments. You can think Jaffrey or Venables to the least arid John Prince. And you can see that the richness of natural regeneration is increasing as you increase overstory tree retention. I think that's a no-brainer. You just have more seed sources to fall on them. Here's another interesting thing. As you increase tree retention, even in the uncut control, we have a lot more natural regeneration on the forest floor. So, natural regeneration happens when there's old trees around. If there aren't old trees around, we have a lot fewer species and there's a lot fewer seedlings coming up. It's kind of a no-brainer. The Douglas fir, if we look at that alone, it follows the same model. This is just height growth. And so this is where, foresters get really hung up, right? We're saying, oh, there's more height growth out in the clear cut, less height growth in the partial retention areas, except that it's almost as good in this 30% retention. We're just losing it at these really high retentions. And even then, look at the trade-offs with survival. As we get into climate change, I think we're going to be far more interested in what's surviving than what's growing fast above ground, because those survivors are allocating their energy into their roots to survive those droughts. Okay, so now I just want to quickly look at these genetic effects, and I'm going to look at 3 of our sites. This is just a picture looking down at Malcolm Knapp Research Forest. You can see the 30% retention, the clear cut. Here's this is the 60% retention, and then this is the sea tree and our control forest, and this is another replicate. So let's look at Jaffrey first. This is our hottest site, and I'm looking at Douglas fir survival, and let's just ignore the height for today. But as we increase in tree retention, you can see that generally survival is a little bit, it's a little bit higher in these average retention areas in this hot, dry area. That, if you look back here in the most arid place, this would be at Venables, this would be at John Prince. You can see at Venables, as you get into these more arid ecosystems, retaining these old trees is more important for boosting survival from roughly, it looks like about 70% to 90%. So it may seem small, but in this world that we're coming into, it is a big deal. These big old trees on these drier sites do make a little bit of a difference. This is at John Prince, where it's actually colder, so we have different stresses. It's frost, and you can see that where we're retaining 30 to 60% of the forest, that actually we're getting higher survival. I'm mixed up. These are the origin of the seed sources. So in those seed sources that are under more arid conditions compared to the local conditions, which is the green, you can see that we're getting higher survival again in this partial retention treatment. Okay, when we get into the more replete areas, so this is Redfish, which is near Nelson, which is where I live. It's our most productive site. And you can see that, hey, they're actually doing the best in the clear cuts. That's what we all expect. But look at, they're also doing really well here in the partial retention area. And the seedlings that have been migrated from the furthest sites, from the driest sites. So that would be, so our local seed source here is the blue one here. That the stuff we've migrated from the driest site is doing the best under a partial retention canopy. So the important thing here, and I'm sorry if that was a bit confusing, but if we're migrating seed sources from drier to cooler climates, that retaining old trees, especially under cooler or under more stressful conditions, those old trees make a huge difference in their outcomes, their ability to survive. Okay, so retaining old trees isn't just important for regen, it's also important for fire risk. And we all are worried about fire risk, of course. So we did a fire risk assessment across all of our treatments, across all of our sites. I know this is a bit of a confusing map, or a graph, but basically this is from the clear cut to higher retention. And this is on average how fire risk is going down. And you can see no matter where you are on that climate gradient, the more trees we're retaining, the less slash ends up on the ground and the fire risk goes down. There's many reasons for this that are not even reflected in the measurements, but old trees are more resistant to fire. And they have, when you cut fewer trees, there's less slash on the ground. And old trees also, through their ability to hydraulically lift water from in the soil, they can spread it through their mycorrhizal networks to their neighbors, and this keeps the forest moist. So partial retention or even no cutting at all is actually the best way that we can protect our landscape from fire. But of course, we're not doing that. We're continuing to clear cut, and now we're finding, and people are writing about this in the newspaper, that these clear cuts are actually spawning fires, that because we've simplified them so much and reduced the broadleaf composition and understory composition through brushing and weeding, that these fires are now spreading from clear cut to clear cut to clear cut, because there's very few old trees there to stop them. Okay, so here we are back at Fairy Creek. This, as I said at the beginning, this was a serious summer last summer. It's going to be another serious summer at Fairy Creek. And I would say if we don't transform our practices here and all across this province, across Canada, that we're going to see more of this. It's going to become more traumatic. It's going to disturb all of us. So as people who are looking after the land, it is in our bailiwick to figure out good ways forward. So in summary, I'll say that, yeah, forests are under climate stress and fire stress and flood stress, and these things are all linked together. So is forestry, and this will amplify in the future. Protecting old forests is important, and this is going to mean not spreading the cut over a bigger landscape, but actually taking that hard decision and reducing our AAC so that we have a more protective regenerative forest. We can use partial retention forestry where we do harvest, and that can mitigate climate change by keeping more carbon in the ground, keeping biodiversity, and also enhancing regeneration. And this tree retention is going to become more important as the climate becomes more harsh, and it's more important on sites that are already harsh. And we can migrate genotypes from warmer climates. It works, and they can do really well, especially if they have the old trees over top to protect them. And these patterns, though, even though we tried like 5 different ones in the Mother Tree Project, and it's an experiment, so we have to replicate them across and make sure they're comparable across these climate regions, but we can try all kinds of things. This is just the beginning of trying stuff. And I urge you to try and leave higher retention leaf patches and design them in different ways to protect species and protect the old mother trees especially. And we can do this. We can transform our forestry practices so that we protect more. We can restore sites that are damaged using these concepts, and we can enhance the adaptive capacity of the forests moving forward. So with that, I just thank the Mother Tree crew, and I'm open to all of your questions. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was fabulous, Suzanne. Thank you so much. I think I can probably speak for all of us in saying that we were on the edge of our seats, and we can just feel your enthusiasm and your energy, and we're thankful for the years of work and all the collaboration, everybody involved. Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay, so as promised, we're going to move on to the Q&A. As a reminder, we're using the Q&A box for questions. We've had a number of questions come in while you were speaking. We have some upvoting going on, which is great. So again, if there's a question that you would also like to hear the answer to, then click on the thumbs up. You can just type into the Q&A. As I said, you have the option, in fact, when you ask your question, to ask it anonymously if that is of preference to you. So I should have mentioned that earlier. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. Suzanne can cut us off if she needs to get out earlier. I'm going to relay them in order of upvote, okay? So the first question came from Jenna, and she says, can you elaborate further on the fact about forestry causing more carbon emissions than oil and gas?
Yeah, so when you look at, a number of countries, including Canada, have been very judicious in excluding certain kinds of emissions from their national protocols. And forestry in Canada has never been included as part of our emissions. And so this kind of information is hard to get. But people have been, it's changing. And I think I'm watching that certain countries that have excluded forestry have changed. I think Canada is on the cusp of changing. But when we do count it, in a normal year that's not a huge fire year, the emissions from oil and gas are roughly equal to emissions from forestry practices. So that means, our standard way of harvesting our forests and reforesting results in emissions because, for one, you don't have the trees left on those sites anymore to take in CO2. And even though some of those trees, of course, are turned into long-term storage products, but 65% is basically emitted to the atmosphere on average right away. The other 25% to 35%, even if it's in long-term storage, most of it is gone within 25 years. And so there's a huge pulse from taking off the trees. And then, and so there's no longer trees taking CO2 in, and then there's this pulse. And then at the same time, the soils are emitting more CO2 from decomposition and the loss of forest floor carbon. Okay, so when you count all those things up, and people have done that and modeled it, and they've said, oh, the emissions in a normal fire year are equivalent to oil and gas, roughly. In a big fire year, so back in 2018, I think, or 19 was a big fire year, the emissions were 4 times when we actually counted fires and beetle outbreaks and all disturbances plus forestry. The Sierra Club, and it was the Sierra Club who did this calculation, found that they were 4 times as much as oil and gas. So it's basically just counting carbon properly.
Great, thanks. And I see that Laura has added some of that data right into the chat if people wanted to check it out. Great, thanks. Okay, so here is a question from Giles, a friend of mine. Thanks, Giles. He says, when I was 16, I got to meet forester Merv Wilkinson at the Wildwood near Ladysmith. Merv spoke of a need for changes in forestry practices then, including more selective logging and community forests, smaller commercial plots. And then, so his question is this the future, in your opinion? And is government paying attention to your research? Thank you.
Yeah, I think what Merv was doing is he was keeping the old trees, right? Because he recognized he wasn't thinking of carbon back then. He was thinking more of regeneration, a regenerative kind of forestry. And so it was kind of like what they call in Europe continuous forest cover, where you basically keep a cover of old trees and then the regeneration comes up underneath. And so he was working in coastal Douglas fir ecosystems, and it worked really well in those ecosystems. They're shade tolerant there. It's a beautiful example. There are other examples around the world. The Menominee Forest, for example, is a Midwest mixed forest, and they also do this kind of practice where they leave the mostly a continuous cover and then they basically thin out from below. They've been able to actually increase their harvests over the years and increase the basal area of their forest and make a living from that forest. So, how much you would take out of the overstory depends on the local ecosystem. Some trees require more space, but leaving these old trees is the crucial point, is that they have the seeds that have come from past generations, seen previous climates, they store a lot of carbon, and they house biodiversity. So they're really important. So Merv was onto the right thing. Are my practices, are my ideas being adopted in forestry right now? I would say not yet, because we're still doing the same stuff, but I think it's going to change. And it's not just because of me, it's because of lots of people recognizing that we need to do things differently.
Great, thanks, Suzanne. We have a bit of battle over our upvoting here. The questions are bumping up and down. So next I'm going to read Richard Johnson's question, and he says, Amarillo root rot treatments are conducted on clear cuts, causing, in my opinion, considerable site degradation and loss of surface carbon. How can we harvest our stands without this loss and prevent root disease?
Yeah, it's funny, like, I was working in the Forest Service back in the 90s when this de-stumping practice became so popular. And I did it myself too on some of my experiments in armillaria root rot areas, because that was the thing to do. But as far as carbon goes, it's a disaster, right? Like, it's a disaster because you're pulling those roots out of the ground, which normally would be stabilized in the ground and store that carbon for a long, long, long time. You pull them out, turn them upside down, and then they decompose really quickly. So, and you also disturb that forest floor in a huge way, move it around, gets in a pile, burns maybe, or decomposes. So from a soil carbon perspective, it's not a good treatment to do. What could you do instead? Well, armillaria, the reason you're seeing more armillaria in these clear cuts is because the system is out of balance. So by clear cutting, for example, you create this enormous food base for armillaria, which is a pathogen. It changes into becoming actually a saprophyte at that point and starts decaying these roots. And then you plant a Doug fir or a larch or a pine, which are all susceptible to the disease, and they get infected. And then they spreads from tree to tree. So the act of creating all these stumps actually increases the inoculum load, and then planting in these really susceptible trees increases the infection. So what can you do instead? Well, leave some of the old trees around and let the natural biodiversity recreate that balance. So there are trees like birch and aspen and deciduous plant trees that are more resistant to armillaria. And if you mix them together, the likelihood of your commercial tree getting infected is way lower. There's all these there's physical barriers in the soil. It's got a different soil microbial community. That microbial community is more like an immune system, and it keeps the infection in check. We've been doing some recent research on this, even as much as like a couple of years ago with a grad student of mine. And I can say that microbial community and the health of that microbial community is extremely important. And it really does matter if you scrape everything away, get rid of it, and start with this really unhealthy situation. So I say work with the ecosystem, and I think we need to get away from de-stumping. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Verena Blasey. Hi, Verena. Can you elaborate on some similarities between your findings and Indigenous knowledge?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think that there's a really nice synergy with Indigenous knowledge systems, and I'm actually working with a number of nations in the Mother Tree Project, and getting more and more collaboration with First Nations. And the reason that the reason I'm doing that is because it'll be so much better, better informed how to protect these ecosystems. But also what we're doing resonates with Indigenous knowledge. So the idea of mother trees and grandfather trees and grandmother trees, and that they look after their kin, that we're all kin, resonates with Indigenous knowledge systems. So they seem to be they go together. And I think that, I was just listening actually to an Indigenous man earlier today, and I've heard this many times, and it's, the old ways of the Indigenous people worked for when the populations were low, when when the colonization had not happened, when the climate was pretty stable relative to now, that there was plenty of food, there was plenty of resources, and the Indigenous ways were in tune to the environment, in tune to Mother Earth, attuned to the mother trees. Now we're out of balance. We need to rebalance our ecosystems. And so we need to find ways to work together to to create new ways of moving forward, combining all knowledge systems. And so, yeah, I'm working as much as I possibly can with Indigenous people, and even more and more as I move along, because that is where, a lot of the wisdom about the land is held in those millennia of knowledge systems.
Beautiful answer, thank you. I'm not seeing it right now in the list of questions, of which there are many, so you can tell that your talk has been provocative, but something that I think you could probably clear up really quickly that I saw come up earlier, there was someone who was not understanding the term kin.
Oh, kin, okay. Yeah, so kin, so that's the relatedness. So, when a tree produces seed and that seed falls and a seedling is produced, that seedling is kin with the old parent tree. Those are kin, they're related. My child, my daughter is my kin, my mom is my kin. So it's just relatedness.
Perfect, thanks. I thought just clear that up quick. There's a question from Susan, and she says, do you think the necessary transformation can occur under the current professional reliance model at forestry?
That's a big question. It's politically fraught. You know what? Professional reliance forestry places the responsibility of practices on an individual, the individual professional. And these practices are more than about individual people, and it's our collective responsibility. And, I just think that professional reliance, that individual is got all kinds of conflicts of interest with their boss, with, what they think should be done professionally. And so I don't think that professional reliance is going to help us move forward, because we have to make collective decisions about complex systems that work for a broad range of people and creatures, and putting that responsibility on one individual is not going to work. It's just not going to work. It hasn't worked in the past. It's going to become even harder as we move forward.
Great, thanks for trying to tackle that one. Next question is from Carol, and she says, what are your thoughts on thinning in older forests to reduce wildfire risk while maintaining mother trees? Are there benefits to retaining a higher proportion of younger understory trees in these stands?
Yeah, no, I think thinning is a great tool. And because we've got fire suppression as part of our history too, that we need to deal with. And it's resulted in, these understories of trees becoming thicker and actually increasing fire risk. And severe fires don't help forests either, right? So it is our responsibility to go in and thin out these forests that have become too dense in the understory. And when you thin, like, the common knowledge in forestry is that when you take out some of those weaker understory trees, you actually increase the health of the mother trees that are left behind, or the big old trees that are left behind. So yeah, it definitely has a big role to play in increasing resilience. It'll actually spawn probably regeneration as well, and it will make the forest healthier.
Great, thanks. Okay, so Michelle, she's asking, it is my understanding that there's currently a referendum on forestry practice happening in the province. Have your mother tree project's findings so far been shared with the Ministry of Forests?
I think that probably most people in the Ministry of Forests have seen some of my talks or read my book, or I don't think most people have seen something. So I think that has been shared. Have I been specifically sharing with people in the ministry? I know that my close colleagues in the ministry do know about it. I even have students that worked on the Mother Tree Project who are working in the ministry. So yeah, the ministry knows. I have a meeting with the district manager next week, and I'm going to talk about mother trees and and about forest practices. So yeah, the ministry knows. I would be surprised if they didn't at this point.
Great, thanks. This is a practical question, and you might be able to follow up more directly. It's from Lori Jo. She says, how can I get teen students from the East Kootenays involved in the Mother Tree Project? P.S. My Environmental Youth Network teens all read your book, and they want to say thank you.
Ah, that's sweet.
yet?
Yeah, you can contact me. Right now we're waiting to find out if we got funding for this year. We applied for a grant, and our ability to hire students depends on the grant. So that said, as we move forward, and I'm going to just say, we're going to see huge changes coming forward really quickly with respect to carbon pricing, the value, how we value forests from a carbon and climate change point of view. I think it's, if we start, once we get a price on carbon and valuing our forests for carbon credits, there's going to be a lot more money available to the broader public than just to, just to the forest company who's making profits, than just to government who then doles it out to social services. Once we change over to a carbon well-being economy from the extractive exploitative economy based on timber harvesting, I think there's going to be money flowing to communities. And once that money flows to communities, they can start, the kids, the grandparents, me, all of us can be out there looking after our forests and making a living from it. So, okay, so that's a long answer to a little simple question. And so the simple answer is we're waiting for funding, and yes, we would love to have them. But let's keep pushing down the road for a more rather than just grants, to change our economy so all of these kids can be out looking after our forests.
Thanks, that's great. Laura Sachs asked a question. I was curious about this as well. How long before orphan trees, reforested areas with no mother trees, start to be well connected into rich microaisal network?
Yeah, good question. So when you clear cut a forest, on average, the 100 species of fungi per hectare that's in an old growth forest, and most of our forests here, they winnow down to just like a handful. And that handful, those 4 or 5 species that are left, are growing on whatever green plants can be there. And then you plant seedlings, say, or if they naturally regenerate, they become colonized shortly with this handful of fungal species that are, very weedy kind of species. It's like the dandelions of the fungal world. And it takes about 50 or 80 years to recover that whole 100 species that was there before you harvested it. So it takes quite a long time. But they do regenerate. They do come back as long as the soil hasn't been, really trashed. Then you have to have more intervention. Then you've got to move soil in with inoculum.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to jump to a question that's been bumping up and down here, and it's from Kevin, and it says, I have a question regarding the soil carbon in the 60% retention. Mm-hmm. Where were the test plots located, as I don't see how retaining 60% of the stand in clusters would result in less carbon than 30% retention?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I have the same question. So, the way that we did the 60% retention treatment was basically putting in machine corridors and then thinning from below. That was the treatment more specifically. And so there was actually some machine traffic in areas. But, I think that the plots, and of course, are also permanent plots. So we put a plot in, not knowing where those trails would have been established before we started. And then we go back to that plot over and over and over again. And so when we looked at that data that you're talking about, and we said, wow, that, it doesn't make sense that the 60% is the same as the 30. And so then what we did is we doubled the number of plots in all of our soil assessments. And so we're looking at the 3rd year post-treatment. So it could change a little bit. But the point here is that putting machines in, and even if they're thinning from below, you have to be so careful not to disturb that forest floor. It's, even we're picking it up. So there's a message there, and keeping in mind too, this is not just one plot. We're talking about thousands of plots. So I feel pretty confident that we picked something up that's real, but we're trying to get a better handle on it. I think that, one of the things is that, we use these great big skidder tractor things. And we need to start thinking about getting smaller machines that are more versatile, more flexible, that can do more craftsman kind of forestry. They're using these kinds of machines in continuous forestry practices in Europe. That's, I think, ultimately what we've got to do if we really want to save this forest floor carbon. which I think we really do.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm just gonna ask a related question here, and then I'm just gonna note that we're well over time, so we might have to cut off our questions here. So this one is anonymous, and it's related to what you just said, so you might have just addressed it. You mentioned that there are lots of ways to prevent forest floor disturbance during harvesting or tree removal activities with technology. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, so I know that this probably won't be popular with a lot of people, but you know, I really think that going back to hand falling is really important. Or if you're going to use a machine, to these small craftsman machines, you know, that they exist. There are good, you know, the operators need to be trained up. We need to make forestry and harvesting a real craft, and then charge the appropriate price accordingly. So, which we don't do, right? That's why we're sort of in this race to the bottom. But we really should be going for a race to the top, where we're doing the best forestry and charging top dollar for what we do. So yeah, hand falling, small machines, lots of people out there doing it, lots of jobs. That's how I see it moving forward.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so we have still some questions. I think I'm gonna ask people to not submit any more questions. And then how's your timing, Suzanne? Do you think that I think
maybe
you
5 more minutes?
5 minutes. We're just going to do 5 more minutes, and I know that she has to jump in her car and whiz away to an appointment. So next question from David. Why does richness go up? More light or disturbance?
Why does richness go up with?
I don't know. Yeah, okay. I know. Yeah.
Yeah, so richness in the drier forest, you mean? I think so. There's a couple things. I'll just comment on 2 things. So yeah, in these drier forests, they are more open, but they also have resource limitations. And so resource limitations are you can address, you know, ecosystems address that by having more species diversity to get at those resources, more fungi that can get at scarce water and deep layers, for example. So in the soil community and the lower plant community, that's where most of the biodiversity is housed. It's not just a matter of light, it's about all the resources that are needed to be acquired. When you clear cut, the early plant community, and I don't know if this is what this person is asking, but the early cereal plant community, actually richness goes up compared to an old growth forest in general. And that's because you get a whole bunch of species that are, we call them ruderelle species, that love open conditions, and they can be very abundant and they can be quite diverse. And so we often see that, but then it doesn't sustain itself. It does eventually, those species start to die out. And it's not just richness, it's how these species are distributed. You tend to get more dominant species of weedy species in those early plant communities. I don't know if that's what the question was about, but that's a long conversation to be had.
Yes, no kidding. Okay, well, I think, so I'm gonna, for your sake, cut off the questions, but there are just 3 questions left. Okay. So 2 of which are from Mindy, and 1 is from Suzanne. And so I might just encourage both of them to connect with you directly. For sure. Okay, all right.
That would be great.
Yeah, that's great. That was all very engaging. It's so hard to present in front of a screen when you can't see everyone, but you did it beautifully.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a couple little notes that I wanted to say, and that is, of course, another round of thank yous. So thank you to the Columbia Basin Trust for your financial support. A big thank you to everyone who has been donating to this series. Again, we couldn't have done it without you. Thank you. A recording of this talk will be posted to the event webpage. You can find that at cmiae.org. We'll get that up within a week. It'll be less than a week, but that's what I've been saying. And please share these recordings with your network. There's a fantastic series of talks being curated here, and we really hope to share them out. Next week, actually, we're going to be taking 1 week off, so not next week, but the following week, we'll be welcoming Dr. Colin Mahoney. He's a research climatologist with the Ministry of Forest, Lands, Natural Resource Operations, and Rural Development, of course, the Flynn Roard now. And I suspect that many of you might be unaware of Colin's work, but I promise that his work is very interesting and you'll want to attend this talk. He'll be presenting a talk titled Grasping at Familiarity, Making Sense of New Climates of the Columbia Mountains. There's a new and expanded abstract on the event webpage. So if you've already looked at those abstracts, I would encourage you to go back and look again. This new abstract provides more detail on what he'll be presenting, and it looks great. So we'll be meeting back here on Thursday, February 24th, over the noon hour at 12 p.m. Pacific. And again, you can get in touch with me or look at the website if you have any questions. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. And thank you very much, Suzanne.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.